I've come to the realization that as long as I am an advocate and I am helping people find or refine or remember their power, it doesn't really matter what work I'm doing. That is the role that I like to play, that I need to play in this life.
Hello and welcome to the Conscious Communion podcast, where we traverse through the inner dwellings of the human experience through conversation. I'm your host, Danae. Join me as we explore the interconnection of creativity and community. Edwina Koch is a multifaceted professional deeply committed to supporting individuals through significant life transitions. With a background in social work and education, Edwina currently works a 9-to-5 within the education system as a dedicated social worker while pursuing her master's in social work at PSU. Her passion, however, lies in birth work, where she shines as a trusted doula and advocate for maternal health. Through her LLC, superdoula.com, Edwina offers invaluable support to expectant parents and families, drawing from her extensive experience and profound dedication to holistic childbirth practices. Beyond her professional pursuits, Edwina has a deep love for travel and exploration. I met Edwina through a previous podcast guest, April J., and I'm so glad to be here with you now. Welcome, Edwina.
Yay! It's so funny to hear your bio read back to you. Like, what? That's me?
And so much else, right? Like so many other things.
Yes, totally. Yeah. It's hard to write a bio about yourself because you're like, well, even before I even wrote it, I was like, what am I supposed to emphasize here? Because we're only, I believe this human form of myself is just like one form of myself. And like, there's so many other things that I'm not able to capture in both my human body and also like in words. So starting off this podcast real deep.
I love it. And it's hard to find language for the ethereal realm and how our spirit translates in other spheres, right? Like we're so much more than the physical.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. Language, I also have a master's of French linguistics, and it's just like, and I try to learn as many languages as I can, but there's just like never enough words to describe all of the emotions that we go through.
That's beautiful. Yeah, I remember hearing that you did your residency in France. So the exploration piece also, I'm sure just capturing language in different countries, that in itself, right? Things have different contexts. So building new ideas and insights around what anything means, right? Is so different for our cultures and sociological work. You're seeing that often and all the time, I'm sure.
Yeah, no, definitely. And it's finding the balance between the importance of language, because it is very important. Like in my work, especially, you can't hold people accountable for certain things unless you have language to describe what is happening, what the consequence is that needs to be done. But we also get caught up in the words when the work is actually just spiritual. So it's the balance. It's a yes and.
I love that. It is a yes and. I think I have a tendency to get caught up in words often, and more often than not, it's really like lay your ass down and breathe and just ground yourself in the here and now so that you can actually remember why you're here rather than getting caught up in trying to find the deeper analytical meaning of whatever X, Y, and Z means,
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So as just a wonderful Kickstarter to getting into the flow of this conversation, what was the catalyst for you that kind of led you to embarking on the work that you are now sharing with kids and families and really a sociological network of people?
What was the catalyst? I think I don't know that there was a specific moment, but I have my hand in a lot of different pots. I'm like a social worker at a high school, and then I do birth work, and I'm a birth doula as much as I can be. And I'm always balancing those two things. Um, and, I was saying to you before we started recording, like I've realized throughout my 20s, I've come to the realization that as long as I am an advocate and I am helping people find or refine or remember their power, it doesn't really matter what work I'm doing. That is the role that I like to play, that I need to play in this life. And that realization has come to me many different ways throughout my 20s, and I'm very grateful that I've like done so much trial and error, and I've never had like one single industry that I've worked in. Like I was a designer, I did marketing, I had my own like nonprofit type thing, and then I was in a school as a teacher. Like I've done everything, and then I've also done therapeutic work and spiritual psychic mediumship work, and I just keep having it revealed to me like over the last 10-15 years that the work doesn't actually matter, but as long as I'm an advocate and I'm helping empower people, that's what matters. And I'm so glad that I have that wisdom now, because without that wisdom, like figuring out a job that I could hold down and enjoy was really, really hard. But now that I have that, I'm like, okay, I could do whatever it is. It's just as long as this role stays the same and I'm an advocate, I'll be fine.
Wow. That's so beautifully said. I think that that's really getting to the heart of the matter, right? Which I think is so important for so many of us. And I think that's something I've had to come to terms with as well, because I don't necessarily love my job, and yet I'm helping people and I'm supporting people. And ultimately, that's what I feel like so much of my call here on earth is to do, is to support people and help them feel safe. And so if I get to do that, even if it's in my 9-to-5 where it doesn't necessarily align, I'm still doing something that does make me feel good at the end of the day because I'm supporting folks. So yeah, thank you for that perspective.
Yeah, I had that conversation a lot too. Like, it doesn't matter. The work that we do doesn't really matter. And you can look at that two ways and be like really nihilistic about it and be like, well, it doesn't matter, so I'm just going to do whatever the hell I want. Or you can say to yourself, like, the nitty gritties of our jobs, like even when I was an entrepreneur fully and I was managing my own time, there were still aspects of it that were annoying and I hated. But what was important was that I was fostering and taking care of my relationships with other humans. And that's what matters. Ultimately, that's the only thing that matters, in my opinion.
I'm right there with you. I couldn't agree more. I think that that's the essence of spiritual work, like our relationships to self, of course, but how we interact with others says a lot about our spiritual hygiene in our work, right?
Yeah, 100%.
Yeah. That's beautiful. Yeah. So where did birth work come in? How did that get started for you? What sparked that interest?
I just knew, I always knew I was going to be a birth worker. I didn't know what type or where in birth work I was going to fall. Like when I first went to university, I was going to be an OBGYN, quickly realized I'm not a science person, dropped that. I've always just loved birth. I'm always asking people like, oh, you have kids. Like I was like, 17 asking people like, tell me your birth story. Like that's like bizarre behavior, but it just told me like I had this deep passion within me. And I also think like that was ancestral as well. Like my mother's birth stories were really, I was born out of the country. I was born in the Philippines, and the way that she talks about giving birth in the Philippines versus giving birth in the US, I think just really sparked this passion within me as well. And I had a couple other folks in my family that had birth stories that they shared with me that sparked that and kept that momentum going. So by the time I wasn't able to be an OBGYN, but I just knew I was going to be in the birth world. And then I figured out I could be a doula, but I wasn't able to commit to that because I was not living in the country for like my first like from 19 to 26, I was living in a different country and I couldn't be a doula there. So when I moved to Portland, I was like, okay, this is my time. I can finally dedicate myself to being a doula and get my training, and that's what I'll do. So it was like I knew it was going to happen. I just had to figure out the human timing of when it was going to happen.
The human timing. Not always on our time, right? But so were you in France when you were kind of like when it was brewing, when it was kind of being conjured? I mean, granted, you mentioned that when you were 17, you were already asking about birth stories. So it sounds like it was really implanted into you, into your spirit from long before.
Yeah. I was in France, but when I was in France, I was like doing something totally different. So I just wasn't really thinking about birth other than asking people for their birth stories because I knew like I needed to focus on this other thing that I was working on. Before I left for France, I was working at like a prenatal yoga and postpartum yoga studio in Manhattan. And that was like my education and my intro into that world. So I was like, okay, I'll come back to this eventually, but it's fine. I know it's going to happen. So I'm not worried about rushing the experience.
Totally just trusting that the universe has your plan in its time, right? It's not always our time, but it's in the time that it's meant to happen. And I'm curious, what did with your mom sharing your birth story being in the Philippines and then how that differs to a birth in the United States, what emboldened you to kind of like get enriched with your ancestral experience of, becoming a doula? Like what was the spark in that? Because I think the ancestral spark really brings a lot of flavor to the mix when you're going back to your roots of indigenous wisdom from wherever you come from. So can you shed a little bit of light on what kind of inspired you through that vein of reference?
I think just working with a lot of spiritual people over the years just reminds you like it's all ancestral. It's all ancestral. So like I wasn't really looking at it from that lens for a while, but then you just begin to realize, I think as you become a more spiritual person, a more woo-woo spiritual, whatever that means. Like I very much like have my hand in the woo-woo world and not. So like I don't use the same vocabulary, but I think as you get more internal and trust and believe in all of these things of being connected with each other and with our ancestors, I think it's just like a natural progression of like, oh, okay, I have this because my mother, and when I look at my life and my passions, and then I look at my mother's story and her passions, and then you just begin to explore that. It's just really, really interesting and insightful. And like even before that, my mother is just the most amazing woman, and I was the worst teenager, just a terrible human. Like, and I'm not afraid to admit that now because I went through a lot of therapy and made amends with my mother, but we did not have a good relationship for a little while, and it was totally because of me. She just unconditionally loved me during that 10-year period of like me just being a horrible person. Just like, an adolescent teenage girl. And so I think that being able to go through that work and like look at my mom and see how strong she was and is, I just have so much respect and so much to learn from her. And her birth stories in particular, she's 5 kids. So I grew up with 4 siblings, and that her birth stories have always been inspiring to me. Like before I even started the journey of going inward, 4 of her births were pretty much home births in the Philippines because you don't have the option to have an epidural. You don't have the option to have a C-section. You will not survive because my family is from a very, very remote area. We don't have that type of equipment in the hospitals that we have. So that was that, to know that is a possibility and still have children is just strength in and of itself. And then my mother, her third child, her husband passed away. Her first husband passed away 2 weeks before the birth of her third child, my sister. And the woman gave birth and is still like, that alone is incredible. And then she had me with my dad in the Philippines. And because of like paperwork and stuff, my dad wasn't able to be there for my birth. So she was there with like alone or with our family members. Then for her final birth, she was in the States. She still had this like cultural acclimation that she was going through. So she didn't have a voice to advocate for herself. She didn't have her family near her. She was in a foreign land with like, my dad was there, but my dad had never gone to a child's birth before because he missed my birth. So she was like alone, totally in this foreign world. And we, as United States, citizens, already have the power dynamics. So I can only imagine the added nuance and power dynamics that were at play at my little sister's birth, my mother's final birth. And so she had every intervention. This woman who's totally capable of having a natural birth, totally capable of like feeling all the sensations and being fine, just had every intervention possible. And I think she had an epidural. I think she even had she had some major suturing done. I want to say she had also, trigger warning for anyone listening to this. I'm talking about birth and I'm going to be talking about some details. I think she had an episiotomy for that one. So, and it was like the 90s, so they didn't really have consent during that time. So yeah, I think it was majorly just hearing those stories throughout the years growing up and then realizing as I became a woman, what that actually meant in terms of like losing your power and like losing your body's autonomy. And just as my own passion has grown, I keep reflecting on my mother's stories and my mother's life. And I'm just like, holy crap, I can't believe you're my mother. Like there's a reason you're my mother, obviously, And so, yeah, it's just been, again, just not a moment, but just something that's built over time that just keeps making sense. And I keep having like, oh my gosh, of course, moments.
Thank you for sharing that. That's, I think, especially just knowing a little bit more about your background and what lights you up, the systemic issues that we have in the United States with the power dynamics, like you mentioned, with the power structures that be, and with birth specifically, how oftentimes women do not feel empowered to use their voice when they're in a hospital setting because of the structures that have been here for a very long time. So I'm curious, because I know that you also are passionate about carceral work. How has that also kind of embedded itself into the mix? Because that is in itself such a structure of power dynamics and systemic issues that are all really sociological. And if we look at the language, we can really see how it all connects, right? They're not separate. So I'd be curious how that kind of came about for you.
That one actually is kind of a funny story, and it involves April J, a previous guest on the podcast. Because it was never, so also just to preface this, my birth work is transitioning into prison birth work soon. And I never had the intention of working in the carceral system at all. But as I continue to get more and more into my role as an advocate, and social work, and I hate making this parallel, but working in a school, and then I have students graduate and end up in situations, because I work predominantly with the population, and Portland is very unique. The demographics of Portland, and I grew up in Jersey City, like right outside New York, so it was a big culture shock for me to move to a place that is predominantly white and to read and learn about the history of our brown and black folks in this community. And that's basically who I only work with brown and black folks pretty much in my high school work as a social worker. And I'm just very passionate about that history and the dynamics and how the carceral system is intertwined in a lot of our schools. And I don't know, it's really been, this is something that I'm like processing in live time of like, why am I going into prison birth work? How did I end up here? But it just keeps popping up as an opportunity in my life. And it goes kind of back to April J, because a few years ago, I met her because I was a client of hers. I just wanted to do like a session, a spiritual work session. And it wasn't a major theme in my session, but it came up that I was like going to be working with, inmates or in the carceral system. And it was a very brief detail, but it stuck with me. And then after that, it just kept showing itself in my life of like, this is an opportunity to do this, or like, this really aligns with your passion and your advocacy work. And it doesn't scare me. Like, it excites me. And I don't know, it just keeps showing up. So I can't really speak to it fully because I'm very much in transition into that work right now. But I just think that we have a lot of work to do in this country around that system, and it's horrifying. But I also think there's something within me that's saying I need to do the work. I need to be part of it. So it's not even anything that I can really verbalize. Again, it's not one of those moments where I don't really have the words. I just kind of have the knowing of like, no, this feels like the right step. Because also as a community, and we say community birth work, that's like the clients that are just, regular doula clients. That work is really interesting to me, but I also feel like I'm needing a change. I need a shift right now. And there was an Oregon House Bill 2535 that just passed last year, where we're now allowing doulas to assist the prenatal and postpartum education in the facilities in Oregon and assist the labor and delivery process. Because a lot of, I'll say women, in this case it's women, but birthing people are still shackled in this country when they give birth as inmates, which is horrifying to say, but when you see it, it makes me emotional to think about. And I think like I see like the emotions that come up as another sign of like, no, I do need to be doing this work. So yeah, I don't know what I just said. It's kind of a long ramble, but all of the signs are just like pointing toward a certain direction. And I've always been someone that just kind of follows that. And that's how I've like led to my next step.
I love that. Trusting the intuitive process of what spirit is guiding you towards. It's really sounds like you have opened up your heart, and there's an evident sense of trust that I'm feeling from you and witnessing in you. It's exactly what you mentioned earlier about knowing that you're interested in birth and hearing birth stories and knowing that it was there, just not time. And so I look forward to hearing more when the words come, because as you mentioned, we have a lot of work to do. We have a lot of work in so many systems, and the carceral system is one that is already appropriated with so many issues. And so to put your love and intention into the mix of how you can be an advocate just really speaks volumes to your character and what lights you up. So thank you for staying curious.
Yeah, you got to stay curious. I feel like that's the only way to be. And a huge sign too is like I got laid off from my job recently at the school because I was like, dang, I have this opportunity to do prison birth work, but I love my job at my high school. I don't want to give that up, but I would have to if I continue to do this work. But because of budget cuts that are happening in Portland public education right now, my role was cut. And I was like, my initial reaction was obviously sadness, but then it was immediate like relief of like, of course I got laid off, like, because I need to do this other thing. That totally makes sense. So having that trust and curiosity has just allowed me to like ride these waves way better in life, because there's been so many things that have come up and I'm like, of course, because this is going to lead to something else. And I think as that happens over and over and over again in life, you just become a more spiritual person, you know?
Absolutely. Yeah. And I love that you said ride the waves. You also surf.
Yes.
Am I correct?
I'm not good at it, but I like to be in the water.
But still, I mean, I think I'm not good at it either. And I can surf, but sometimes it just feels good to paddle out and just kind of like ride the waves as best as you can. Right.
Yeah.
It's just like life. It's such a beautiful representation of spiritual work, riding the waves.
Yeah. I like to make water analogies a lot because I just feel like we have to be like water.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more. I think that when we're not, we'll feel it. Like you feel that crunchy stagnancy and friction real quick when you're pushing up against what the universe has for you and you're trying to fight it or just not be agreeable to what the thing is.
Totally. And that's a great, to bring it back to birth, because you know, that is kind of what I'm on this podcast to talk about. That's a great metaphor for just like coping with the contraction. Like when you are fighting your body and your jaw is clenched and your brows are furrowed and you're just like clenched, like your body is resisting the contraction and it doesn't allow you to expand and have your cervix expand. And the spiritual work of birth is finding a way to ride the wave and relax all of the tension out of your body and allow yourself to expand as you're having this wild wave of sensation. Mm-hmm. Like that is just like the perfect metaphor that goes right into birth. It's the same thing.
It's so interesting because after just doing my own research and informing myself as much as I can with the birth process, one of the most intriguing things I've read thus far is that birth can be a pleasurable experience. And for so many of us in the States, we've never heard these concepts, right? Like, how could birth be pleasurable? Because we see these images through film, or I don't know, we hear horror stories left and right of how traumatizing birth is. And while it can be that 1,000%, and it's not to negate those experiences either, it's also to invite what else could be, maybe that we haven't known. And so I'd be curious if you could give a little bit of context to what that means for folks that have never heard of what the pleasure and pain portal could look like in a birth scenario.
Yeah, that's such a great point. And a lot of people, even like in orgasmic birth, having an orgasm while you're giving birth is a thing that happens. And when that happens for people, because we live in a culture that predominantly speaks of the pain and trauma of birth, when that happens for people, there's also a lot of shame that comes with that, because it's a not normal experience to have, quote unquote, but it's actually pretty normal. And I think that like my advice to my clients is always, you can do all the moves and the prenatal yoga and prepare your body, and that's great. But I prioritize the mental and spiritual work of birth and the breath work even, because that's like, mind body experience. If you can prioritize one thing and you're training toward giving birth, it would be that, because it requires a lot of, I don't even know the word, but it's like suppleness in your body, like just a lot of trust in your body and a lot of mental fortitude. It's kind of funny. I'm not pregnant or anything, but I try to practice it now. I like take cold showers, and I'm like, what would it look like if I just didn't treat this cold shower as torturous? If I was just like, no, this is pleasurable. I like this experience. Like that is the training that you need to be able to have a birth that isn't just tension and pain. Um, so yeah, I don't know if I answered your question, but birth can definitely be pleasurable in some senses. It's definitely not comfortable 100%, but it doesn't have to be this resistance. I think that if you work on not resisting, the birth can be way more positive than you imagine it to be.
And that's like speaking to exactly what you said, the spiritual experience. The spiritual experience isn't always comfortable. And yet recognizing that the dark shadows that we get to navigate through, that's where like so much of the nectar gets to come into play. Like I know for me, I can look back at my dark night of the soul or moments where I've felt that dark night of the soul essence come into the mix. And those are the moments that I'm most grateful for, because those are the moments where growth is, it's in the happening, and it's happening fast. And so when you actually go with the flow, when you're like water versus being strict and stagnant around that thing, then you can actually let go a little bit and just kind of let the universe carry you, right?
Yeah, definitely. And that is, we were talking a little bit about home birth versus hospital birth, and there are pros and cons to both, but home birth, that is the one thing about a home birth that you don't really have in a hospital, is the ability to just relax and go inward. Because in a hospital, your nurse has to come in every 30 minutes and check things, and everyone's asking you questions and things are beeping, and you can advocate for that space, but only so much, because there's the liability of being in a hospital. Whereas being in a home, you do have that ability to just like go inward and have your private spaces where you are able to tap into that sense, that internal wisdom, which you can totally do in a hospital as well. But it's just like, came to mind that, that difference.
Absolutely. The training is talking about mental fortitude, right? Like that's a different kind of training. When you're in the structure where you're feeling the power dynamic, and that can bring up a lot of friction. I had an experience where I had to go, I had to go to the ER not too long ago, and just feeling like the pressure of being in a hospital, that alone brought up a lot for me. And just prior, I had been in a hospital setting with a loved one that was sick. So it just like these images that we conjure up from other past experiences, potentially, that can also create restriction if we allow it to.
Yes. And everybody is coming into the room with their own stories and their own friction. And I had a teacher that said, gosh, the birth experience would be just so different if we all just stepped into our bodies and came into the room with a full awareness of what we're bringing into the room. And I always just remember that quote of like, when I prepare myself for a birth, it's like, okay, what am I bringing into this birth right now? And like, what can I like put my like, what are they like, Qigong gloves on? I'm probably totally butchering that, but someone recently said that to me. And like, how can I protect my space and protect the energy of those around me and be aware? And like, to what you said about being in contact with the medical system, I'm having a weird medical issue right now, but the Western medical system is great because obviously there are wonderful things that happen and it's right at our fingertips, and I've been so fortunate and grateful for that. But then I also saw someone, just like a holistic life coach type thing, and we weren't even really talking about my medical issue, but it came up in conversation, and she said, do you have an intuitive idea of what might be happening for you medically, of like what's causing this? And I was like, holy crap, I wish we made our doctors and medical Western practitioners ask us that question and believe us and like make that a valued and question that's asked, because I totally do. And I totally think it's like something hormonal, and now she made me realize like I should go do a test of like what my hormones are right now so I can figure things out. But it was just so much, it was so powerful. It put power back in my hands of like my medical issue, which is so nice, because I think asking that question helps. It helps bridge the gap of like, this is my body, I have my own wisdom, and I also need help. So the Western medical system is great too, but that question is like, how can we work together? My innate sense of knowing and your scientific sense of knowing. Like, let's figure this out together. We don't do that in our medical world. It's like the Western medical system makes us believe, and made me believe in this situation, which was a good reminder that I am powerless. I'm having a medical issue and I have no idea how to take care of myself. I have no idea what's going on. And that's what that system does. And doulas and people like this who ask these questions are a reminder that like, yes, we need these treatments and this health system that we have. That's great because it helps a lot of people live long and higher quality lives. But we also need our own ability to know our bodies, and that wisdom needs to be brought to the table and valued, which we forget.
Yeah, it's coming back to the remembrance of exactly what you brought up earlier, which is like that ancestral wisdom.
Mm-hmm.
Like our ancestors knew. They did their due diligence in every way that they could with the tools that they had. And by that person empowering you to ask that question of what your intuition was telling you, that must have felt so wildly like enlivening for you to just be like, okay, yes, my senses have been awakened to this the entire time. Mm-hmm. And doubt can creep in when the medical system is over here telling us potentially one thing, right? Like that we need to depend on X, Y, and Z, which there's a time and a place, right? It's the collaboration piece. We can use both things, but I think it's important for us as individuals to feel empowered as to do what makes most sense for us.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And I think to bring that to birth too, because I think that like when you've never gone through birth and you're a very spiritual person, and this is just giving the realities of birth, because I do like to shed light on that mystery. I think like it's very easy to say, but I'm going to innately know what's going on. I need to trust my body. And we use a lot of these things and these phrases, and I think they are very powerful. And it is, my role is to trust people's bodies and remind them to trust their bodies and remind them to trust their intuition. Yes, and during birth, it is such an intense experience that sometimes you don't have that same connection to intuition that you might have on a normal basis. And so to be able to have people in the room that are connected to your intuition, you being the birth person, having those people around you who you trust because they understand you and have a connection to like what's going on for you internally without having to speak is so important. Because when you're in this foreign pregnant body, it is such a new body that you're just learning. So that sense of intuition of like, oh, I already have lack of tuition sometimes now with my, like anything that comes up for this medical issue, for example, now add a foreign baby, like new body to that, you're disconnected. And in that disconnection, it can be easy to have this like doubt creep in and then have your power taken away. So just having people around you that help remind you of your power and connect you not to your intuition, but just like that have a different perspective, I would say, than just like the Western medical perspective is so important.
That's awesome. Thank you for saying that. Yeah, I think it's been a journey being pregnant, and there have been moments where, you know, I've questioned myself and how far along in my spiritual path I am, because I'm like, whoa, my hormones feel like they're really getting the best of me today. And this can feel really aggravating at times.
Mm-hmm.
And rather just to notice it, like I find so much more ease when I just allow myself to observe and to witness that thing that may feel uncomfortable, but to just be a witness versus trying to control it and trying to like positively shame myself into feeling better about it. Like that's not going to help. But having a community or advocates around me to remind me who I am, like, you're pregnant. These are hormones, and that's okay. Right? It's like, I'm curious to know for you, because for you to do this work, for you to be the space holder for these people that you get to show up in space for, there's such a spiritual hygiene of care that you have to go through. I know that you mentioned, you know, you do your best to ground before going into a room, but there has to be more that you do in your daily life. So what does that look like for yourself as a doula and as someone who advocates for people?
Yeah, that's a really great question that I'm still trying to answer because I'm doing something right, but I don't know.
Yeah.
Sometimes I don't know. And this week I think the timing of that question being asked this week is really great because I've been having a very challenging work week at my 9-to-5 at my high school. I've had some students come in with really challenging stories that I have not been able to like just leave like I usually am able to. And, you know, certain birth stories will stick with you as well. So I don't have like strict routines because that doesn't work for me. It never has. Like I've definitely tried. But I definitely have little traditions that I like can pick up and like put down. So like, you know, and like, there's so many that I could talk about so many things that I just do. I think that you hold a lot of these things in your body. So one of the biggest things that I do is just moving and dancing and singing and getting all of that like gunk and trauma and those stories that you don't want to hold out through those somatic practices is like probably the number one priority for me. And I don't even do that with the intention or realization that I'm dancing because I need to get this out. I'm just like constantly dancing. So I do think that has really helped me ground my energy, and like constantly singing. So that's really nice. That's just like a practice that I grew up with that I think has sustained me over time. But in a particularly challenging week like this week, when that's kind of not enough, I do have to like really hone in on certain rituals. Like I have my gratitude journal where like every morning I wake up. This week I've been doing this every day. Like I'll write my 3 gratitudes for the day, and I like to make them unique, and then an affirmation for that day, like an affirmative statement. And then at night I go over 3 great moments that happened that day. And I also try to make them like unique and like very small moments because it's so easy to be grateful as a blanket statement. And then I do like one thing I could have improved on that day. And that is very helpful during weeks that are really hard because it helps. I think gratitude is just so important. But again, like it's really easy to just be like, I'm grateful for everything. So just having an acute gratitude practice is really a big, big tool for me. And then, you know, there's all the other tools like therapy and talk therapy, which I'm kind of having a weird relationship with right now because I think I've done a lot of talk therapy. And at this point in my life, talking is not actually helping me. It's body and breath practices that are helping me a lot more. And my relationships. I'm like very grateful that I've put in a lot of work to have some really cool freaking people in my life who just like are able to call me out on my shit or sit with me in my shit. And like that's probably the most impactful thing. You know, I have a lot of people that are just able to hold me when I'm having a rough time. I don't know what I would do if I didn't have that. So all of those things, all of the things, so many things. And I'm still trying to add to the list.
Totally. It's having, I think you said that beautifully, because I think in my past, in my experience, I was someone that stuck to a specific ingredient list that doesn't actually serve most people well. I think that it does to a certain degree. Structure and discipline certainly has its place. And also, what does it look like to embody that fluidity, right? It's knowing that each day we're going to show up differently, and one tool might not work great for a specific thing that may come up. Mm-hmm. And I know that that's been very true for me in my experience, where, especially as a pregnant woman, like it's just, you know, today I needed to go for a long walk and get some sun. Yes, I journaled. Like that feels like something that feels really good. But sometimes my breathing practices, for instance, like I'm not doing the same breathing practice every day. I'm doing a breathing practice, sure, but it looks different every single day. Mm-hmm. Because it's how am I going to show up in my here and now and see what I need.
Definitely. And I think that is also going back to what society tells you something is versus what you innately know. Like when I think about meditation and how we've branded meditation in this Western world, it's like, are you sitting on a cushion and thinking of nothing for 30 minutes a day at 5:30 in the morning every day? Like that's meditation, yes, and that is extremely valuable. Like my partner does that every day, and that is extremely valuable to him. But my meditation is singing and dancing in the shower for, 10 to 20 minutes a day. That's also meditation. And I can tell that my soul needs that. It's a release for me. And that is extremely valuable. And sometimes I have days where I'm like, oh, but I didn't do my meditation and on my cushion today. And like, am I even helping and taking care of myself if I haven't done that? But like, again, it's one of those, I just have to constantly remind myself, like, I'm doing the work. Like I am doing all of these things. I'm going for runs. I'm moving my body. I'm doing all the things. Just because it doesn't look like society's told us it has to look doesn't mean that you're not doing it. You're definitely doing it.
Such a good word. Such a good word. And yes, I think that too translates to birth work, right? Like each birth is different. And while I have not yet been inducted into that beautiful experience, it's going to be, here for me soon enough. And just to read the different stories that women have gone through. And, one woman could go through different births, like your mom. Your mom is a perfect example of that. Mm-hmm. 5 births, different from the next. The last being the most different out of the other 4.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. And I think information is so powerful that it's extremely powerful, especially when in pregnancy and in birth, when if you don't have information, then you don't know what you can fight for, So when you don't have that intuition speaking to you, it's the information that's then even more important. So yeah, I don't know. I lost my train of thought, but definitely it's always like a yes and situation.
It is, isn't it? It's for everything, I think. And it's funny because my therapist, he says, let's try to move away from the buts. I think that buts sometimes obviously play a role. And there's also that yes and. Mm-hmm. It's moving away from the dualistic nature to the non-duality. Like, mm-hmm. such a juicy part of our experience when we can see things as they are rather than the black and white and realize, no, we're multifaceted beings. It's what you said earlier. Yes, we're living in the physical, but also like, yes, we're here in the spiritual, and we get to live this human experience as spiritual beings. Like, really, that's what we're here to do, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I have a quote on the back of my phone that I just feel like I want to read.
Yeah.
That I just kind of speaks to that. And it's kind of a quote that like makes me even more grateful these days. It says, "I like to pretend I already died and asked God to send me back to Earth so I can swim in lakes again and see mountains and get my heart broken and love my friends and cry so hard in the bathroom and go grocery shopping 1,000 more times. And that I promised I would never forget the miracle of being here."
That just got me really emotional. Yeah, I got chills. Yeah, that's really beautiful. It's funny, like the grocery store. It's like, I would miss that. I will miss that. It's so, It's like one of those things. It's like, I love moseying around new seasons, taking my sweet time, you know, just like, that's so beautiful. Yeah.
And it's just like, I think it's just a reminder to the like, all of the gunk and garbage, that also makes us feel alive. You know, like all of these things are so important, and our lives and our birth stories are not going to be these most amazing positive experiences, but that's okay. That's part of the experience. The beauty is being a human and like being here, getting to experience the full spectrum of the things that get to happen to us and the emotions that we feel. And that's why we're here, you know, like I'm so grateful for that.
Thank you so much for that. I do want to touch on this before we start to wrap up, because I know that exploring is such a big part of your soul and what enlivens you. How has exploring, traveling, how has that been kind of just something to revitalize you in the work that you do? Because to be an advocate is exhausting. It's a beautiful, energetic process, but it takes a lot of energy, right? So how does exploring and traveling invigorate you to carry this work of being an advocate?
Yes, great question. So many thoughts come to mind. One is I'm so glad that I started my professional work life in France, where people don't want to work. Like the culture is like, why are you working so hard? Stop working. Like go on vacation for 8 weeks. That's what you need to do. So that just like on the forefront of my work life helped train me to think of work that way. Number two, I have worked jobs, like I remember working in my corporate tech job and just feeling exhausted every day because I hated the job, not because of the work. Like going to work exhausted me, because now I would argue that my job as an advocate is actually one of the hardest jobs that I've ever had, but I feel so energized by it because most of the time, because it's like coming from this different source of energy that's driving me. So that is like how I help keep myself sustained. And I have also learned to create really strong boundaries around my work. And travel is like a big part of that. I don't know that I'm capable of working not on the school calendar, because I'm able to say, okay, from September until June, I am working really hard. And then for 2 or 3 months, I am it's like every summer, I just like go through a rebirth of my own identity. And I get to just like sit and I'm not just like traveling aimlessly, which is also valuable, but I spend my summers just like going back to friends that I have known throughout my life to just like remind myself of who I was in different spheres of my worlds, so that I can kind of gather that information about myself and be like, okay, like, what do I need to shed? Who am I? Like, I need to remember who I am. what is this going to do for me and how am I going to shape my next step? And it's like so beautiful to be able to have done that for the last 10 years or so. Because I think we all need that time to just like take a break from whatever the hell this is, this whole world that we've decided to live in, and just be like spiritual for, a couple of weeks or days if you can. I think that's so important, and we just don't really prioritize it in North American culture, unfortunately. So I'm glad that I work in the education system, because that's the way that I'm able to have that.
Yes. Yes for that. And yes for being able to prioritize that, because I mean, it is important. I know that the first time I went to Europe, I was like, oh, okay, this is really different. The pace of life is just a pace I crave, it's very different. And to know that you get the time off that you do in summer, in Portland summer, like, oof, granted, you are taking the time to travel, but to get the sun and to rebirth in the midst of what is really, truly, we are blessed to live in such a beautiful place, because summer just goes off here. It is insane.
It really is nice. Not that I really ever see it that much, but it is really nice when I do.
When you are here. So one final question for you. If you had one slice of wisdom, whether it be within your birth work or just in your own personal life, what would you care to share with our listeners?
I think this piece of wisdom is really just like me speaking to myself as I go through this wacky transition of like losing my job, and now my future is totally an unknown right now, but I have a lot of ideas. And I think the advice and the wisdom is just, it always works out. And it's important to have a plan and do all of the things and try to open up as many doors as you can and create those opportunities for yourself. And as long as you're doing that, your spiritual guides and person, all of that will come and help you as well. And like, you'll figure it out. It might not look like how you planned, but as long as it's like, again, we talked a lot about this bridge between two worlds, and just always remembering that it'll always work out, but you have to trust, and you also have to do the work and have the trust. Like it's both. But I'm just like excited for this time, because it is a scary time for myself to like have an unknown, especially when I was really loving my job and feeling really comfortable. But I know that this is for a reason, and my life has just unfolded in the most incredible way so far. So it's going to be fine. I'll be fine.
Thank you for that. And how can people find you? How can people work with you?
If you'd like to work with me as a birth doula, my Instagram handle is superdoula. Doula is spelled DOULA _. Yes, that's my Instagram handle. And you'll find my website and all of the things through my Instagram.
Perfect. Amazing. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for your time, your energy. You're amazing. You light me up. So thank you so much for.
Oh my gosh, this was such an awesome conversation. I appreciate you.
I appreciate you. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day. Sending you so much love.
You too. Bye.
Bye. Hey there. It's Danae again. Just wanted to say thank you for sharing your time and energy with me. If this podcast resonates, please like, subscribe, follow, and share if you're willing. Reviews help too. So if you're feeling the vibe, please leave a review where you can. Sending all the love. Peace.